Okay, now this is really the last one for Chapter 53. So this is Part 6, and actually I'm glad to take the time to explain these different formulas because they can be kind of confusing, and so I want to make sure that I'm spending time to explain them all. So again, what I was talking about before the last one ended is this blip that occurs here in our growth rate has to do with some populations overshooting the carrying capacity K before they settle down to a relatively stable growth rate. And so here, again, if you remember when we have a negative slope, what that means is that our death rate is exceeding our birth rate. So that's what's occurring right here until it evens out. So now, life history traits. There's a link. We aren't going to talk about evolution until the very end of this course, but the AP Biology curriculum does interweave the different concepts throughout the course. So one of the things I want to make sure to point out is that these life history traits are products of natural selection. So the things that are going to produce the best reproductive success and the passing on of genes to the next generation is going to be something that is favored as an adaptation. So an organism's life history is going to be comprised of traits that affect its ability to reproduce and survive. And so these are evolutionary outcomes reflected in the development, physiology, and behavior of an organism. So there are three major variables in life history. There's the age at which reproduction begins, how often the organism reproduces, how many offspring are produced per reproductive episode. And there are two types of life history, let's see, what do you want to call these? Approaches. You can have semelparity or iteroparity. And so species that are semelparity type organisms have what we would consider a big bang reproduction. They reproduce once and then they die. And the perfect example of that are Pacific salmon, which exhibit this type of reproductive strategy. They return to their freshwater streams to spawn and then they die. So that's what semelparity is about. In contrast, there are species that have iteroparity, which is repeated reproduction, which is really actually most species have that type of reproductive strategy. And so that would be all sorts of organisms like lizards or humans or primates. All of those have iteroparity, where there's repeated reproduction producing offspring. So what is important to realize, and let's see if I can get this to come up. There we go. What's important to realize with these two different strategies is that environments are going to favor one versus the other. So if you have a really unpredictable environment, or it varies a lot from year to year, then really having this big bang strategy of the semelparity is really going to be a better strategy. But if you have a very stable environment that is dependable, that doesn't have a lot of change from year to year, that type of environment is going to favor iteroparity. So these are just some examples of the one-time versus repeat production. Now, another thing to think about when we're looking at the K value or the carrying capacity of the environment is that we can often have cycles of population growth. And that can be very much a part of the predator-prey interaction. So what you see in this graph here is a change in the carrying capacity of the rabbit population occurring here. And actually, this is two different populations. This is the carrying capacity of the rabbits, and this is the carrying capacity of the lynx, the predator. And so what you're going to see is lynx has a lower um, carrying capacity. So its population max is lower than that for the rabbits, its source of food, which absolutely makes sense. And you can see the interaction between these two populations in terms of population size and how they are interdependent. The other thing that your book is going to touch on is human population growth. So human population growth is actually looks a lot more like exponential growth than logistic. And that's because we have the ability to outthink our limiting factors, and for example, disease. So even though we may get very density filled, very dense in terms of our population, we have the ability and have figured out, for example, through advances in medicine or technology, ways to overcome those limits to our population size. So that's just something to consider when we're talking about maybe exceptions to the rules that we've been discussing because of our ability to use our cognitive skills to overcome our limits. And that's basically what this is talking about. Okay, so the final portion of this lecture is going to talk about age structure. So this is an important demographic factor when studying growth trends, both the current and the future growth trends in different countries. And so we look at the age structure of the growth rate of these different countries by looking at the relative number of individuals at every age. And what we get are graphs that look like this. So this is showing you the relative number of individuals at each age. So you can see the percent of the population is down there along the bottom, and then going up are both ages and the years of birth, which would also be coinciding with the ages of individuals. And they break it into males and females, as you can see here, to show if there's any difference in different age numbers. So you can see the difference, for example, between Kenya and the U.S. or even Italy, which is very consistent. So what do you notice about Kenya? Hopefully what you're seeing there is that Kenya has a large percent of its population is young. It's very, very bottom heavy in terms of this graph. Whereas Italy, there is actually a much smaller number of young versus the middle-aged group, which shows you that it's a population that is on the decline. Whereas Kenya is a population that is on the increase. So this can tell us a lot of information about the growth patterns and the potential growth patterns of a population. Let's see if this is showing the U.S. and Italy versus Afghanistan. So again, thinking about our ability to outthink our limiting factors, we have this whole debate about, is there a global carrying capacity? How many humans can the biosphere support? And there is some thought that among population ecologists that 8.1 to 10.6 billion people will be alive in 2050. And so this is based on estimates of logistic growth models. So actually thinking that there is a carrying capacity based on how much habitable land there is and how much food is available. This is called the ecological footprint of that humans have. We need food, water, fuel, building materials, and other things in order to support our populations. And so you can see here that there is the amount of land required to support an individual at a standard of living is very different in the U.S. as opposed to in India. It's one way to measure how close we are getting to the Earth's carrying capacity. And this is showing that there's a very uneven distribution in the ecological footprint between the U.S. and, for example, India. This is another depiction showing that ecological footprint. And this one is based on available ecological capacity. That HA is hectares and or hectares, and the ecological footprint per person. So I want to end now with a summary of the different types of growth with an animation from Pearson, and that'll be the end of this chapter's lecture.